Hello my dear sewing friends, it's Alisa here, and today we have our spotlight on the zigzag stitch. Now at first glance, yes, it might seem like a rather boring topic of a conversation when it comes to sewing, but I promise you there is so much more beneath the surface of a regular zigzag stitch that you can find pretty much on any home sewing machine. So in this video, I really wanted to share with you 4 zigzag stitch secrets, know-hows, tips, tricks, hacks, whatever you want to call it, but these really helped me not only to widen the use of my zigzag stitch, but also expand and explore my sewing techniques, and in return make beautiful clothes. I want to start with this first technique because I do use it quite often, so I thought it would be only fitting if I start with this one first. And this is also a very versatile technique because you can use it on knits, you can use it on wovens, and you can use it to do beautiful hems or really fun and interesting decorative elements. So this technique can be used and applied in a variety of different ways, so I am sure that you're going to have fun with it. The steps for achieving this technique are really simple and straightforward. First, let's say I'm working on a sleeve. Now this is knit fabric that doesn't fray, therefore I'm going to do a simple single fold hem and then press. If I'm working on a woven sleeve, that's a little bit of a different story, but not by much. So instead of doing a single fold hem like this, I'm actually going to do a simple double fold hem like this. Just a quick side note here, make sure that your fabric can actually take the heat from your iron. If not, simply pin the hem and let's head to the sewing machine. Here, first I'm going to select my simple zigzag stitch, and then I'm going to increase both stitch width and stitch length, and I'm going to set them both to 5. Now I'm going to increase the tension. I will go from 4 all the way up till 6. Now these are definitely not one and done settings. These are just the settings that I personally like to use. Definitely leave room for trial and error so that way you can find the settings that work the best for you, your sewing machine, and the project that you're working on. Now let's go ahead, take our project, place it underneath the presser foot, lower it, and the key here is to make sure that when we start stitching that the top part of the zigzag stitch actually falls off of the fabric and doesn't pierce it or touch it at all. That is what's going to create that beautiful scalloped edge. Now this does take a little bit of practice, so if you have speed control on your sewing machine, I would suggest lowering that, so that way it will give you more accuracy and more control over these stitches. Once done, you're going to have a sweet little scalloped edge like this one. If after completion you see a slight little waving over here, usually I can remedy that without a problem with just a really good press, and that should bring it back into shape. And then if I have a little bit of extra fabric over here from where I pressed the hem, I simply take my scissors and then I'm going to trim it, not too much because we don't want to trim it too short, but just enough so that way we don't have the excess flip-flopping there on the insides of our garment. Now personally, I absolutely love using this technique on the hems of the garments. It can be a t-shirt, it can be a tank top, a pair of shorts, or a skirt, and if I do the bottom, I usually will do the same on the sleeves as well to sort of like tie it all together, and then, at least in my opinion, it does give a very special and interesting touch to the entire garment. And I also love using this technique when I'm working on undergarments. As you can see, as a result, it gives us a beautiful little scalloped edge, but it also remains stretchy if you're working with knit fabric. Wasn't that easy, right? And that will give you plenty more options for your sewing projects, not only when they are planned, but also perhaps when you're a little bit in the pickle. But also, because I do love this technique and I do use it quite often, I wanted to give you 3 extra tips to sort of like take it to the next level. The first one is, if you have a 3-step zigzag stitch on your sewing machine, I actually love using it even more than just a regular zigzag stitch for the scalloped hem. I just think it adds a little bit of extra texture, and I find that using a 3-step zigzag stitch doesn't pucker fabric as much as a regular zigzag stitch. So if you are using using this on knits, you might find that this gives you a better result than just using a regular zigzag, and the process is going to be exactly the same. Another thing, which is tip number 2, that you can do for puckering is to either use a wash away stabilizer or interfacing or a knit interfacing, so that way it's a little bit easier for you to sew and the fabric doesn't ripple. And tip number 3 is to test this technique on a scrap fabric first. With that, I have found out that this technique, particularly for me, works really well for lightweight and medium weight fabrics, but not so much for heavyweight fabrics. And also some fabrics, especially knits, do tend to curl. So by doing a little swatch and test first, you can clearly identify the issues and avoid them in the future. Now, did you know that you can actually imitate a flat lock stitch and a blind hem stitch by using a regular zigzag? Now the steps for both are nearly the same, so let's go ahead and start by pressing the hem and then folding it in like you would for a regular blind hem stitch or a flat lock. Now let's select the settings, just a regular zigzag stitch, and then for the stitch width and stitch length, I like to choose the largest values that I have, but again, it's not mandatory, so go ahead and play around with the settings and see what you like. Now on a tension dial, however, I will go all the way down to 0 if you want your fabric to lay absolutely flat once we're done. Now let's take our fabric and place it underneath the presser foot, and here I find that the trick is to make sure that the zigzag stitch is even on both sides, and then the crease of the hem splits it right down the middle. Now this is what you're going to have once you're done. Now all we have to do is pull it from the right side of the fabric, and as you can see, the fabric now is completely flat. You can also give it a really good press, and on the right side of the fabric we have a stitch that looks like flat lock. Now the fun part about it is that you can vary stitch length, width, and tension and get different results. This was obviously the sample that we completed together. This one might look very similar at the first glance, but you can see the stitches are closer together. And this one, the tension was set on 2 instead of 0. And as you can see here, the crease of the hem remains, which I actually happen to like more than just a flat hem. But I think it's all just a part of a personal preference. But the good thing is that all of these remain stretchy, which is really important if you're working with knits. Now where you have tension set on 0, it is stretchy, but not as stretchy where the tension is set on 2. So you definitely have to gauge on the project that you're working on. Now for a blind hem stitch, I'm choosing the same regular zigzag, and the only setting that I'm going to change is the spacing of the stitches, which I'm going to increase to the largest value that I can. Now when I'm starting to stitch, the trick here is to make sure that the left side of the zigzag barely touches the left side of the project, because that is going to be the visible part of the stitch on the right side of the fabric. Now with this particular technique, I do go very slowly, sometimes even resorting to hand cranking the wheel, because that does give the best result. Now this is what you're going to have once you're done, and now all we have to do is to pull it apart. Obviously here I'm not using a matching thread, therefore you will be able to see these stitches, but if you're really careful and do a really good job, you can use this as a substitute to a regular blind hem stitch. These are especially helpful when you want to hem a knit garment, but you don't want that zigzag stitch to be visible on the right side of the fabric, and you just want a little bit of a different technique to finish that hem and for it to retain its elasticity. Now if you'd say that a rolled hem on a serger is one of my all-time favorite techniques, I probably couldn't really argue with you, because I do have quite a bit of different examples in my wardrobe to prove that. But before I had serger, this zigzag secret and technique number 3 is the one that I used all the time, and I really want to share it with you today. Besides, it's great not only for hemming the raw edges of lightweight and medium fabrics like cotton voile, some of the silks, and many others, but I also use it in order to finish the raw edges of the seam allowances, so that way they won't fray. I have a piece of cotton here for our sample, and for the settings we will leave everything as is, but we do want to decrease the spacing between the stitches to the lowest that you can. Now sometimes in my other videos and tutorials where we actually make a garment, you might have heard me say something like finish the raw edges with a serger or with a tightly spaced zigzag stitch. So that is what I'm usually referring to. I'm going to grab my piece of fabric. It does help if you made a little tail over here, so that way you can help out the fabric a little bit, so that way the sewing machine doesn't chew it up. Before we start, I actually like to increase the speed on my sewing machine because for this particular one, I think it goes a little bit smoother and nicer. Now, gently helping the fabric move along, let's go ahead and start stitching right on the raw edge of the fabric, so that way the stitch that is being formed will completely enclose it. After you're done, this is what you're going to have. I remember there was a period of time when my mom loved going to the local fabric store and going through the bins of fabric remnants and picking out these beautiful silk chiffon pieces that then she would turn into beautiful scarves. And this was one of her go-to techniques in order to hem those edges really nicely. Alright, zigzag hack number 4, and this one will be particularly useful for those who love the look of shirring, but perhaps the standard way of doing it might be just a little bit too fiddly. Now, the standard way of doing it would involve taking your bobbin and your shirring elastic, then hand winding it, then adjusting the tension, then I usually try it on a scrap piece of fabric to see if I need to adjust anything else, and then I can start shirring. Now, with this hack, it might be just so much simpler and you might enjoy it a little bit more. We're going to use a piece of cotton fabric, and here I'm also using a slightly thicker elastic cord in color, so that way you can actually see it on camera, but you can also use just a simple shirring elastic. We're going to select our simple zigzag stitch, and here you might want to leave it as is or adjust it a little bit depending on the thickness of your elastic. Now let's take our fabric and the elastic cord and place it underneath our presser foot and lower it. Once we start sewing, the key here is to make sure that the cord remains in the middle of our zigzag stitches, sort of creating a little channel for gathering later on. Once done, this is what you're going to have, and then you just simply pull on the elastic and ta-da! This is what you're going to have. Now, obviously, in order to achieve the look that you see on this sleeve, you would need to do multiple rows of this technique. But other than that, it really is that simple and that straightforward. And I truly hope that all of the techniques that I showed you today will help you in your sewing just as much as they helped me. And here's another thing. Knowing techniques is really, really great, but sometimes we do need the right tool for the job. So here's a video where I show you 11 sewing tools that, in my opinion, are truly worth the money and every single penny. So thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in this next video, and until next time, happy, thoughtful sewing. Bye!